Here is another oft-stated discriminating factor that purportedly defines the difference between the East Coast sound and the West Coast sound. Another distinction often stated to discern East Coast and West Coast is that East Coast is for traditional music. There are many reasons why a person could come to that conclusion, and certainly, comparatively, Moog instruments did make a splash in traditional music. There's no doubt about it. But in distinguishing between these two types of instruments or synthesis styles or inventors, this is a designation where people say, oh no, Moog wanted to do traditional music, or Moogs were designed for traditional music. But that is simply not true. And here are some reasons why I think people think that. In 1968, when Wendy Carlos released Switched On Bach, Switched On Bach was an extremely groundbreaking use of the Moog synthesizer, possibly the most popular use of the Moog synthesizer in its early years. And instead of all of the different ways that the Moog synthesizer had been used in collegiate and 20th century composition applications, this album released by Wendy Carlos was the thing that got famous. And why? It was because it was accessible. Unlike so much electronic music, which was fascinating and intellectual and academically stimulating, this was an album of well-loved music with brand new contexts through timbre, brand new explorations of the Baroque compositional style, and a whole bunch of really cool things, but things that people were familiar with. So they listened to Switched On Bach, and they were like, oh, this is a synthesizer. Here it is. It's a classical instrument. Here it is being used in this Baroque album. Yeah, okay, I get it. And that album became very popular, and it was really the means of introducing the synthesizer, the Moog synthesizer, to the world. And it worked. It got everyone excited. It connected with everyone. It became a big thing because of this album. Also in 1967, there were a number of popular artists that used a Moog synthesizer, the Monkees and the Doors, and of course there was the Beatles using the Moog synthesizer. Now, these instances are very, very famous instances of the Moog synthesizer being used in popular or traditional music contexts. And since they're popular, people think like this is representative, but it really wasn't. Of all the synthesizers that went out into the world from R.A. Moog, very few of them comparatively were used in this particular fashion, and most of them were used to create traditional 20th century electronic music, which was abstract and experimental and groundbreaking and visionary. That's what Moogs were used for. It wasn't until the 1970s that the popularity of Moogs being used as musical instruments in the traditional style became most prevalent. And this instrument, which basically simplified a modular synthesizer to a degree that allowed the poor, hapless, normal musicians to use them, meant that that instrument got used a lot in popular music of a variety of genres. And it introduced the Moog sound to the kids, the younger people, and rock music, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Mini Moog really was the ambassador. And then, after Bob Moog sold R.A. Moog, Bob Moog wanted to keep R.A. Moog focused at the universities, at composition, at, traditional classical sort of composition. Once he sold the company, the latter owners directed Moog towards making consumer type musical instruments for pop artists, basically. I mean, that's what Moog synthesizers became, as you well know. Most of the Moog synthesizers that you know are, the Mini Moog and the Memory Moog and the Micro Moog and all of these instruments that are largely directed exactly at traditional usage. But that was a corporate choice. That was a money-making choice that happened way after Bob Moog did what he did when the Moog synthesizer was invented. Also, I will say this thing about Wendy. She didn't say, hey, what we should do is we should use the synthesizer in traditional music. What Wendy was merely saying was that it could be used in a context that wasn't this academic context, which was focused on serialism and a bunch of 20th century compositional styles that were inaccessible to the average music listener. Wendy Carlos, who loved traditional music, was like, we can do more than just that with synthesizers. Here's an example. So it wasn't that she was advocating only traditional use, or that's what this synthesizer was for, but rather saying, look, we can do anything we want with this. And it would be great to hear a synthesizer doing, traditional tonal music for once. And the truth of the matter was that not only were Moog synthesizers not being used to make traditional music at all of the academic institutions that had them, they were doing all kinds of different styles of music and all kinds of different focuses, and mostly abstract 20th century music that was focused on the unique aspects of the synthesizer. Popular music thing started off as kind of a sideline. And here's Joel Chataway with his sequencer-based Moog synthesizer used in academic context and well respected. So, these are the people who really represented Moog initially, before it became Moog technology became very popular in traditional music.